Welcome to our program. Our program today is sponsored by the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, and we are very pleased that you could join us. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. And just to remind you that today's program is, of course, sponsored by the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences and also by the Critical Race Initiative in the Department of Sociology. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our wonderful speaker today, Professor Evaristo Benyera, whom I will introduce to you momentarily. But first, I would like to go over some technical issues. As you know, today's program is being recorded, and when you join us, you are muted and your camera is off. And by joining us today and by participating in this program today, you consent to your image, likeness, or voice possibly being recorded. You will have an opportunity to ask questions on the Q&A option on the bottom of your screen, but we will do that at the end of the lecture when we will open it up to the audience to pose their question. So today's lecture examines issues, very important issues, that are fundamental to the Bahá'í Chair's vision for world peace. And these issues that are going to be presented in today's lecture include the elimination of structural racism and prejudice, and the role of the nations in their ability to cooperate on an equal level and collaborate in the interest of the common good. In his lecture today, Professor Benyera explores the meaning and structure of racism, paying attention to the mechanisms that sustain it. Using the decolonial lenses, he argues that racial ontology, as a product of capitalism, not only structures racism, but also sustains it. So it is with great pleasure that I would now like to introduce Professor Benyera to you. He is an associate professor of African politics in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of South Africa in Pretoria, South Africa. He holds a doctorate in African politics from the same university. Professor Benyera researches and publishes on community-based non-state transitional justice, human rights, transitology, and decoloniality. He has worked and researched in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. He has edited 3 books, 18 book chapters, 13 peer-reviewed journal articles. And I'd like to read just the titles of some of his books. First, Breaking the Colonial Contract: From Oppression to Autonomous Decolonial Futures, Reimaging Justice, Human Rights and Leadership in Africa, Challenging Discourse and Searching for Alternative Paths, Indigenous, Traditional, and Non-State Transitional Justice in Southern Africa, the case of Namibia and Zimbabwe, and his latest book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, The Recolonization of Africa, Coloniality of Data. And the last one is being published by Routledge publisher. Professor Benyera is actively involved in peace building in Africa, working as a peace envoy of the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference in the Eastern Democracy Republic of the Congo's Walikale territory, North Kivu province. In his native Zimbabwe, he is involved with bottom-up peace building with the Heal Zimbabwe Trust. Today, the title of his talk is Decoloniality, Ontology, and the Structure of Racism. Professor Benyera, it is a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Hoda, for the opportunity, and thank you very much for the very generous introduction. It was very kind of you to introduce me that way. It is my pleasure to come and share with you my views on the topical issue of racism. The title of my presentation is Decoloniality, Ontology, and the Structure of Racism. My presentation will be from a decolonial perspective. This implies that I have to justify why the decolonial perspective among many other perspectives. I will give you 5 reasons why I went with the decolonial perspective, besides the fact that I'm a decolonial scholar. Firstly, decoloniality allows me to locate the origins of racism. We need to locate the origins of racism so that we can correctly address it. Secondly, decoloniality allows me to unpack the institutionalization, routinization, maintenance, and normalization of racism. Through decoloniality, I can account for the resilience of racism as rooted in violence, ontology, prejudice, and white privilege. Fourthly, through decoloniality, I can understand the shortfalls of racism campaigns. And finally, it allows me to propose an alternative way of resolving racism. Colleagues, warm African greetings from Pretoria in South Africa. When we discuss issues in Africa, no matter how important they are, we tend to tell stories. It will be un-African of me to discuss the issue of racism, the role of the state, and other structures that institute, maintain, and routinize racism without sharing with you a short story. This is a story that I am going to take by a book written by Chinua Achebe. The book is called Things Fall Apart, and I will read from page 125 to page 127. I will be skipping a few of the lines, and I will start reading from the book. But apart from the church, the white men had also brought a government. They had built a court where the district commissioner judged cases in ignorance. He had court messengers who brought men to him for trial. Many of these messengers came from Umuru on the banks of the Great River, where the white men first came many years before and where they had built the center of their religion and trade and government. We must fight these men and drive them out of our land. It is already too late, said Obiarika sadly. Our men and our sons have joined the ranks of the stranger. They have joined his religion and they help to uphold his government. If we should try to drive out the white men in Umofia, we should find it easy. There are only 2 of them. But what of our own people who are following their way and have been given power? The white man is very clever. He came quietly and peacefully with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers and our clan can no longer act like one. He put a knife on the things that held us together and we have fallen apart. This is Chinua Achebe writing in 1958, pages 125 to page 127. I am reading this paragraph in order to demonstrate the manner in which the institution of the state was imposed, not only on the colonies, but also at home. Because there is this notion that colonialism was only perpetrated on overseas territories. Yet, as I will demonstrate later, racism at home constitutes a form of colonialism. I send you warm greetings from South Africa. It is a public holiday here in South Africa, and it is one that is called Freedom Day. Freedom from what and freedom to do what? My response will be very brief because it is not the focus of my presentation today. There are 2 fundamental rights and 4 fundamental freedoms. The fundamental rights are the right to human existence, to live life with dignity, and the second one is the right to be born who you are, in other words, epistemic freedom. The 4 fundamental freedoms are freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom from violence, both state violence and social violence, and freedom from enforced silence. In other words, the right to speak out. These are the views of Issa Shivji, a Tanzanian Marxist scholar. 2 fundamental rights, 4 fundamental freedoms. As I speak to you, the remains of Mr. Lindani Miyeni, the former rugby player from KwaZulu-Natal, here in South Africa, who was shot dead by Honolulu police in Hawaii on 14 April 2021, will arrive here in South Africa this Friday, meaning about 3 days from today. Lindani Miyeni was a Black man killed by the police in the United States. Dr. David Fowler, this is the second issue that I want to bring to your attention as part of my introductory remarks. So in the first remark, we saw a South African Black man being killed by the police in Honolulu, the United States. I want to paint a geographical representation and occurrence of racism. Dr. David Fowler, a Maryland state pathologist, was born in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, my native country. He was educated at the University of Cape Town here in South Africa, and he stands accused of dismissing the role of Derek Chauvin in George Floyd's death. So I have brought 3 countries together now: South Africa, the United States, and Zimbabwe. 10 years ago, here in South Africa, in a town called Fixburg in the Free State Province, mathematics teacher Mr. Andres Tatane was shot and killed by the police when he approached the police and begged for mercy on behalf of an elderly man who was apparently not part of the service delivery protest. Like most of us, Mr. Tatane was naive in believing that the democratic South African police force could be spoken to and reasoned with. He was naive in thinking that the apartheid and post-apartheid police forces were different in their attitude towards and the treatment of the Black body. During apartheid, Hector Peterson met the same fate. So did the many miners who were gunned down at Marikana, and the many victims of the now disbanded Nigeria's Special Anti-Robbery Squad, SARS. These few examples have taken us to various places. We have been to Nigeria, we've been to the United States, to Zimbabwe, and to South Africa. This points to a universal structure which produces agents who are perpetrating racism. The structure must have the same origin, and it is very resilient, mutative, and adaptive. In my presentation, I also grapple with the questions: what logics inform racism, which is being replicated across geographies and time? Why is the post-colonial and the post-apartheid states still as violent towards Blacks just like their predecessor states? My argument is that racism is a structure which produces and reproduces agents like Derek Chauvin. A discussion of this nature requires that we be on the same footing regarding what we are discussing. I will offer my definition and understanding of racism. Racism is the hierarchization of humanity into two broad categories, those that are superior and those that are inferior. This ranking of humanity is done by those who deem themselves to be the superior ones. So racism is the creation and sustenance of an inferior class by the superior class. The result are two broad analytical concepts, the humanitas and the anthropos. These are not my own classes, but they were postulated by Walter Mignolo. The humanitas have enforceable rights, while the humanity of the anthropos is doubted. It is questioned, and at times it is even denied. Hence the notion, which was coined by Nelson Maldonado Torres. He termed this the imperial Manichean misanthropic skepticism, which in simple terms is the doubting of the humanity of the Black people. Racism is a structure and not an event. It is backed by the power of institutions, most of which are colonial creations, and the chief culprit is the institution of the nation state. Racism is also normalized and legitimized through laws, policies, stereotypes, norms, and prejudices. The bottom line of racism is that the anthropos lack the right to rights. They lack the right to rights. What do I mean by human rights? As I inferred during my introductory remark, by human rights, I do not refer to the various generations of human rights, where the first generation is given as civic and political rights, the second generation is given as economic, social, and cultural rights, and the third generation is given as cultural and solidarity rights, and so forth and so forth. I refer to human rights as to be born, to live, and to die in dignity. Human rights are to live a life devoid of humiliation. In a nutshell, racism is the product of what is termed the man and its corollary, the human classification. When humanity was classified, someone thought about it and created it. There was no prior template for racial classification of humanity into an inferior race and a superior race, a Black race and a white race. And as I will discuss later, there was no prior template for classifying geographies into the first world, the second world, and the third world. Who did this classification and why? How was the classification normalized, routinized, and maintained to a point where some of us agree that we are the third world, that we live in the third world? My departure point in this presentation is to declare that knowledge creates reality. Stated differently, epistemology frames ontology. If knowledge creates reality, then all societies are epistemic creatures. Someone thought and created these societies. Benedict Anderson would term them imagined communities. Racism, therefore, also originated from somewhere. Epistemically, racism originated from the thinking of classical philosophers such as Plato and Socrates, who asked and attempted to answer the question, what is? The problem is that by asking the question, what is, you are inversely asking the question, what is not? This logic allows for superior, inferior classification, which is the basis of the man, the human, and human rights. The highest form of human rights abuses is the allegation and misrepresentation that all humans are equal, hence the universality of human rights must be believed and not challenged. It's a fallacy. It's not true. There is nothing called universal human rights, simply because if human rights existed, if they were universal, we could not be talking about the persistence and even the intensification of racism across geographies and time. Human rights are not universal, as people's equality ends at birth. Human rights are a preserve of the man and the human, of which not all of us are part of the humans. So the humans that are mentioned in all the Declaration of Human Rights do not take care of all of us, because not all of us are men. Not all of us are part of what is termed the humans. The rights in human rights were also thought about and created by someone. The two epistemic creations of the human and the rights are products of a certain logic which has a particular geographic and biological origin. In the 15th century Europe, the Christian humanists created the identity of the man. This was created to differentiate themselves from their neighbors and their enemies, who comprised, among others, the heathens, the Saracens, the pagans, and the Easterners. We see here the emergence of a paradigm of difference enforced by violence perpetrated on the different other. The Westerners entrusted themselves with the universal authority and responsibility to rank and classify others. This is the origin of white privilege. Allow me to share with you my views on the exact moment in history when racism was inaugurated. I will share two views. The first one is what I can term a psychosocial and physiological origin of racism. The second one, I will term the empirical analysis of the origins of racism, both as a structure and as a practice. Let me begin with the first one, which is not there on my slides. And I want to quote here Charles Pinder Hughes. He was writing in 1971. Pinder Hughes wrote, European whites, upon encountering blacks, imputed on the blacks all the group-threatening characteristics which the whites were attempting to renounce and repress in themselves. By the psychological mechanism of projection, they purged and purified their image, the image of themselves, as they dumped their undesired characteristics upon their image, upon the image of the blacks, and thereby created a pro-white and anti-black paranoia. Role relationships, philosophies, economics, politics, education, and all other aspects of culture and social structure were then altered to support and conform to these false beliefs which aggrandized whites and denigrated blacks. This is page 15 of this article, which was written by Charles Pinder Hughes in 1971. Pinder Hughes goes on to note the work of Jordan. Jordan analyzed, he carried out an analysis of white American and English audiences towards blacks. This was around 1812. Jordan noted a sequence of at least 7 stages which created racism and white privilege. These 7 sequences are very important for grounding our discussion on racism, ontology, and the structure of race in the world. Firstly, There was a readiness to use psychological mechanisms of rejection at the time of initial white-black encounters. So the moment that a white person and a black person encountered each other, the white person was more than ready to project the black as the unwanted other. Secondly, whites deny in themselves and falsely impute to blacks a monopoly on those human characteristics which they do not wish to acknowledge in themselves. So every baggage that the white community had, they offloaded it onto their black neighbors and said, we are not the thieves, they are the thieves. We are not dangerous, they are the ones that are dangerous. If we move around with a hoodie at night, we are not dangerous because it's cold. But if a black person is jogging with a hoodie, he becomes a suspect. Thirdly, elaboration, rationalization, and justification of these false beliefs. They were very elaborated, they were rationalized, and they were justified using eugenics, using false science, using doctored statistics, and other so-called works of scholarship, just to give credence to the view that the black body is a moving crime scene. Number 4, there is the alteration of reality to fit these false beliefs. Whenever there's a black person and a white person and an encounter ensues, there is an alteration of the reality which happened. Or the black man was dangerously looking at me, or he looked dangerous and I was afraid of them by the moment that I saw them. So there is this deliberate altering of a reality in order to project the black other as a dangerous being who is ready to cause harm to society. Number 5, there is this transition of false beliefs and the contravened reality along with and as part of elements of the culture. So once the alterations are done, they are then transmitted and then they are normalized. They are imbued in a society's culture, that it is in the culture of white people to be afraid of black people. After all, black people have demonstrated to be the ones that are feeling the germs. So they are dangerous. Number 6, ongoing dynamic conflict within individuals and between them over the morality or adaptive value of the beliefs or the realities created in their image. So 6thly, we notice that they then tend, rightly so, to be dynamic conflicts between these two groups as a result of the misrepresentation and the transmission of falsehoods about an entire race based on the fear and prejudice of the so-called superior other. Lastly, there then comes in the issue of scapegoating with sacrifices of a part to save the main body of paranoid beliefs, paranoid behavior, and paranoid itself. So the final result is that there is then scapegoating that closes this analysis, this psychoanalysis by Hughes and also by Jordan and Pinda-Hughes. Upon encountering others, humanity understands each other through two ways, depending on the one being encountered. So firstly, there is introjection, or there is projection. One is perceived by introjection only if they are classified as belonging and hence as a member of the group. Then there is projection, which is used to perceive the outsider, the other. Introjection is for the tolerable, like the self, while projection is used to encounter the other, who at times is dangerous and must be dispensed. Human encounters result in either dumping upon them things we renounce within ourselves or accepting them as part of us. In racism, whites are understood by projection and are presumed to be always correct and innocent, while blacks are understood by projection and presumed to be always wrong, guilty, or about to commit an offense. So these are the three states of the black man. Either you are wrong, either you are guilty or you are about to commit an offense, like the three states of nature. So wherever you are as a Black person, you are either engaged in one of the three. You are wrong already, you have been pronounced guilty, or you are about to commit an offense. Having deployed introjection in accepting those like us, or projection in rejecting the other, the dichotomy found in physiology, which commonly involves the pairing of opposing or antagonistic functions, then takes over. We have moved from psychoanalysis and now we are into physiology. It produces opposing attitudes and feelings towards the two resultant categories of the self and the other. For Pinder use, the physiological classification of phenomena into two opposing categories, such as being categorized as a male or as a female, back or front, right or wrong, left or right, black or white, center or periphery, me or not me, forms the basis of racist logic. The basis of racist logic is that there is a binary, either you are black or white, whether you are right or wrong, whether you are with me or you are with them. Using this logic, those with power and resources assign lower value to and repress those with less power and resources. It is at this moment where we see the link between capitalism and racism. The feudal, the caste, and the class systems operate using this logic, that those with power and resources assign a lower value to the ones which they repress because they have got less power and they've got less resources. The state, throughout its genealogy, has been an instrument which dignified whites and thingified the blacks. And this word here, thingification, is from Amos Césaire. It's not my own word. This is the totality of the negatives experienced by the black body: commercialization, commodification, enslavement, experimentation at the Taksagi syphilis experiments. All of them, he termed them thingification of the black body. Whether the state was a feudal state, a caste state, a colonial state, an apartheid state, or even a post-colonial independent state, it performed the same function: that of authenticating the white, that of upholding white privilege and treating the black as a dispensable thing. Throughout its history, the state disappropriately allocated status, privilege, opportunity, reward, and power along the citizen, the super citizen, the inferior citizen basis, and never equitably. The state also sanctioned and perpetrated violence disappropriately along what Frederick Douglass, writing in 1881, termed the color line. The color line mutates into other lines, such as the sex line, the tribal line, the national line, the religious lines, the cultural lines, and so forth. I will reiterate that throughout its history, the state has been doing nothing other than to disappropriately allocate status, privilege, opportunities, rewards, and power along the inferior citizen and the superior citizen basis. And now let me move to the empirical origins of racism, which is depicted on my slide that is being shown. There are two events which occurred in 1492, which in my view produced racism and its structures. The first events were the genocides and the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula of the people that were colloquially referred to as the Moors, and the Jews and the Muslims who had refused to convert to Christianity. From this moment in history, the different other became dispensable. The fall of the Kingdom of Granada to the Christian forces of King Ferdinand V and Queen Isabel I on the 2nd of January 1492 became known as the Reconquista. When King Boabdil surrendered Granada to the Spanish forces on 2 January, racism as we experience and know it today was inaugurated and married to the state and capitalism. The second events of 1492 were the acquisition of overseas territories after what was patronizingly termed as the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus. The genocides of the long 15th and 16th century and the conquering of the Americas produced racism. I borrow from the discipline of economics to deploy the term here, the multiplier effect of 1492. Because after 1492, a sequence of events then ensued based on the successful experiments of 1492, which were the expulsion of the different others and the discovery in courts of the overseas territory and the commencement of colonialism. Firstly, humanity witnessed state-sponsored colonialism and genocide. This is in the Iberian Peninsula. Secondly, state-sanctioned violence was instituted and legitimized as a way of ruling the conquered overseas territories and the local other. So colonialism was effective at home and away. At home, to manage the different other, and away to manage the totality of the colonies. The hierarchization of humanity according to color, ethnicity, religion, culture, sex, and other many variables was also inaugurated. Thirdly, we witnessed the beginning of the use of the law to authenticate violence both at home and on those that were deemed to be different and abroad on the conquered overseas territories. So the law becomes a very important aspect of the colonial project because whatever was deemed to be correct by the men was then legislated into law and quickly enforced. Fourthly, it is also at this moment that Europe and North America began to acquire its status as the center of the world. And by having the center, inversely, Europe, North America created the periphery. There cannot be a center without the periphery because everyone who is not part of the center is automatically part of the periphery. Fifthly, the orthodox model of the nation state was born. And it is still to this day very efficacious in organizing human relations using the same instruments, violence and law. So when the state was created, courtesy of the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, it came with it to Africa, carrying its preferred ways of articulating the statecraft, which is violence and the law. Sixthly, it is also at this moment in history that the notion of the human and human rights were born. The man was linked to the nation, was Christian, and believed by the self to be civilized. Although he then went on to decivilize and conquer other nations. The man had human rights, which he also denied on others that he terrorized at home and abroad. Seventhly, we notice the birth of political identities, especially that of the citizen and the foreigner. Citizens had rights, while foreigners were the invading, defective, and different other. Lastly, it is at this moment that coloniality was born. And by coloniality, I mean the asymmetrical power relations between the colonizers and the colonized. And this asymmetrical power relationship, this colonial matrix of power, is underwritten by capitalism. In discussing the structure of racism, allow me to link it to colonialism, because it is colonialism which gave birth to the orthodox model of the nation state, under whose watch racism is perpetrated and reproduced. Since 1492, colonialism was not only the occupation of the land, but it was firstly displacements. Colonialism displaced human bodies. It displaced civilizations, and it displaced epistemologies. Secondly, colonialism was the creation of networks by forcing the colonies into the following 5 Euro-North American-centric structures, which I argue and present to you as the ones responsible for maintaining, routinizing, normalizing racism. So colonialism was not just the coming of a bunch of white folk and then they start establishing a government and ruling a territory. For me, and most importantly, colonialism was about the establishment of imperial networks, colonial networks, religious networks, academic networks, commercial networks, financial networks. We term these networks of coloniality, and they are very efficacious today in maintaining and routinizing racism. The following institution which the colonies were forced into was the international legal system, even though they did not have the right to enjoy international rights. They were forced into this regime. Secondly, the colonies were forced into a global financial and monetary system, a commercial system. I am reading not my own views. Thirdly, the colonies built capitalist system. The ideology became this. Fourthly, the colonies were forced into Euro-North American-centric culture, especially the languages. And lastly, the colonies were forced into a Euro-North American-centric moral order, which is dominated by Christian thought. Remember what I alluded to earlier on, that colonialism did not only occur in the colonies, but some of the colonies were at home. For example, there was the colonialism of the black body in the United States. In a nutshell, law, commerce, ideology, culture, morality, and religion are the structures which produce, sustain, maintain, and normalize racism. I noticed a meme which was doing the rounds on the social media today, which said that Black folk hate everything about the slave trade except religion. That religion was part and parcel of the processes of colonialism is something that we cannot deny, no matter how religious we are. In fact, elsewhere, I argue that there are 4 predecessors of colonialism and racism, especially here in the global south. Firstly, the missionaries. Secondly, the hunters. Thirdly, the explorers. And fourthly, the traders. These 4 groups of predominantly white Caucasian men are the forerunners of colonialism and racism in Africa. But that is a discussion for another day. Let me turn to the issue of the men, the human, and human rights as they relate to racism and its structures. In this section, I will address the question, when was the human born and differentiated from the other? Who is the recipient of racism? It must be acknowledged that the men, the human, and human rights are all Western constructs, which are informed by Western epistemologies. The men and the human are controlled by Western thought and logic. Because the man, the human, and human rights have a logic behind them, which is not universalistic, but divisive and exclusive. Human rights are therefore not universal. Allow me to dispute the validity of the various generations of human rights as not applicable to all simply because racism still exists. I also want to allege that the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights is problematic because it codified a very exclusive notion of human rights. This declaration was complemented by a parallel process of geographically reclassifying the world into what became known as the First World, the Second World, and the Third World. The First World was inhabited by the humanitas, and it was predominantly liberal and Christian-centric. The Second World was predominantly inhabited by the communist anthropos, who were deemed to be very dangerous. The Third World was inhabited by the anthropos, who were classified as underdeveloped, uncivilized, and needing to follow a predetermined linear path from salvation to civilization, to progress, to modernization, and finally to emancipation. Once classified as the Third World, which must, according to others, play catch up to the First World, and having been classified as underdeveloped, it became logical for those deemed to be underdeveloped to be enslaved, to be colonized, and to be the recipients of racism in its totality. This logic allows for the perpetrator to absolve themselves of any moral wrongdoing and culpability, as they will not be dispensing in their mind the violence not on the human like them, but on the thingified other. So the logic is that the perpetrator, the racist, absolves themselves of any wrongdoing, because in their mind, in their eyes, in their psyche, according to their logic, what they are doing is not perpetrating human rights abuses. It's not racism, because this recipient is not like me, therefore deserves this treatment. Only those that are like me deserves the respect that is reserved for those like me, the logic goes. This partly explains the ruthlessness of slave trade. And just a footnote on the issue of the slave trade. My heart bleeds each time that I hear about the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic Ocean never enslaved anyone. Let us call a spade a spade. It was the British and American slave trade and not the Atlantic slave trade. The humanitas have the power to name phenomenon in such a way that they evade culpability and ascribe culpability to oceans and the mountains. So the slave trade was perpetrated by the Atlantic Ocean and not by some people that can be named. Yet we know that the beneficiaries of the British and American slave trade are still enjoying and reaping the benefits of this heinous act. Practically, how is racism structured and using which institutions to sustain it? This brings me to the role of the Western model of the state as the highest part of the problem of racism. The role of the state in initiating, legalizing, normalizing, and maintaining racism and racial structures is evident in the United States and in South Africa. The Western model of the state was imported and imposed on the colonized as part of the processes of colonialism and remain embedded with the characteristics which it brought from Europe. The model of the state is rooted in 4 paradigms. The paradigm of difference, blacks and white. The paradigm of war, let's go to Libya, let's go to Iraq. The will to power. If you are not with me, then you are with them. survival of the fittest. These paradigms are complemented by what Sema Amin termed the 5 monopolies of capitalism. Global capitalism monopolizes violence and war, police brutality, the war in Iraq, the war in Libya. Secondly, capitalism monopolizes finance. Capitalism monopolizes news. It also monopolizes natural resources and technology. The 5 monopolies of capital and the state complement each other in structuring and underwriting racism. In the 4th Industrial Revolution, robots are the latest perpetrators of racism. How could robots and artificial intelligence fail to be racist when the logic which informs them is racist? Take, for instance, global mass surveillance and the use of artificial intelligence to make state and corporate decisions. The results are bound to be racist because those who thought about artificial intelligence and developed its algorithms proceeded from a racist perspective. Hence, I allege that artificial intelligence produces mathematical and not ethical decisions, most of which are very racist. They maintain and they continue to structure racism. Why are all efforts at curtailing racism failing? I will propose 3 reasons. Firstly, there is too much focus on the agents of racism and very little attention is paid on the structure which produces and reproduces and sustains and even defends racism. Secondly, efforts at curtailing racism fail because of the lack of epistemic freedom. And what do I mean by epistemic freedom? Epistemic freedom is to think, to historicize, to theorize from where one is located and unburdened by Eurocentrism. We cannot use epistemologies that are Eurocentric to fight racism, which is a Eurocentric creation. Epistemic freedom is restorative justice. It restores the humanity of the victims of racism. Thirdly, racism has not been correctly historicized and theorized, and hence the lack of an effective anti-racism blueprint. Without epistemic freedom, we think about racism. The thinking about racism, was predominantly done from a Eurocentric perspective, which only aided in sustaining, reproducing, and hiding racism. So what is to be done? In the self-appointed center, if the self-appointed center is the problem, then decentering is the answer to the problem of racism. But how do we decenter? We decenter by seeking and deploying epistemic freedom. I join others in proposing a model of the nation state where, firstly, the paradigm of difference is to be replaced with a paradigm of diversity. Secondly, the paradigm of war is to be replaced by a paradigm of peace. Thirdly, the will to power is to be replaced by the will to live. And finally, survival of the fittest is to be replaced by survival of everyone. Decentering is a decolonial move that confronts, demystifies, and unmasks Eurocentrism, i.e., the notion that Europe and North America are the center of the world. A question might arise. This is in peroration. How do we decenter a racial world? To borrow from Lovugacheni and Eric Nyembesi, decentering can occur through one of the following 3. Firstly, moving the center from its assumed location in the West to a multiplicity of spheres in all cultures. So there will be a center in China, a center in Peru, throughout the different cultures. Secondly, moving the center within all nations from the dominant social stratum of Europeanized male bourgeoisie minority to the majority of peasants, workers, and women. And thirdly, moving the center from the restrictive walls of nationalism, class, race, and gender. Decentering aims at making it possible for a pluriverse to emerge, a world in which many worlds coexist. In these words, racism will be curtailed. Sorry, in these worlds, racism will be curtailed because there will be one dominant race. There will not be one dominant race, religion, morality, culture, or creed. But first, we need epistemic freedom so that we can think and reimagine alternative pluriverses. Epistemology precedes ontology. Let us think and create alternative realities. We need an alternative to, as opposed to an alternative within. I thank you for allowing me to share these views with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Benyera, for that very, very thoughtful and deep lecture. There's much there for us to think about. I would now like to open it up to questions from the audience. Please, again, go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and please pose your questions. We have the first question is from Danielle Kuntz. I hear many of the themes found in the writings of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Has his work influenced you? Professor Benyera.
Thank you very much. I have been influenced by many scholars of the Global South, because one of the things that we try to do as decolonial thinkers is to privilege epistemologies of the Global South. Since I read his 1985 book called Decolonizing the Mind, I have been a favorite student of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and his work is very seminal to those who want to understand what decoloniality is about and how to reimagine the world away from the dominant paradigm, which has only worked to reproduce the same problems over and over again. So it's true, I have been influenced by Ngugi wa Thiong'o and many others like him.
We didn't hear the first part of the question. Please repeat.
I'm sorry. How should we feel about all of the violence that occurred throughout the world, especially racial violence and sexual violence and many other types of violence before 1492?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine Garcia, for that question. It is a question that has seized me for most of my time as a scholar of race and race relations. That how do we make sense of the violence which occurred through the pre-colonial history? And one theory or one explanation that makes sense is the psychoanalysis based explanation that I shared with you, that when two human beings confront each other, how do they relate, and what logic explains the way that the other one is manipulated or abused by the other? And I think if we use the introjection and projection perspectives, we will actually be able to explain most of the violence which occurred before 1492, before the state took over. So in a nutshell, when two groups met, when two people met, you would see that this person is similar to me, you introject. You see that this person is different from me, you project, and then you subjugate and you perpetrate violence on those people. This is why I brought in this other perspective to account for those acts of racism that occurred before 1492. Christine Garcia.
Thank you. From Wanjiku Kagira, for example, uniting in law, commerce, ideology, culture, and morality, religion, as you stated, of the oppressed is a paramount ingredient for the liberation of the oppressed. Citing African nations, for example, if they were to truly unite, they could tackle the racism recolonization, Why is this not happening in your view?
Wanjiku, that's a very painful question. Why is Africa still experiencing racism 60 years after the first decolonization processes occurred in the then called Gold Coast, which is today's Ghana? My view is that we lack epistemic freedom. We are thinking from the same position with those that colonized us. So we are using colonial logic to fight colonialism. We are using racist logic to fight racism, and we will not win. So I think the call to first seek epistemic freedom, to first sit down, properly historicize, properly theorize, and then we come up with prescriptions on how to fight the scourge of the problem of Africa, the problem of the post-colony. We need an alternative thinking. And that alternative thinking, as I mentioned in my paper, can only come about if we seek epistemic freedom, which is to have the independence to think from where we are unencumbered by Eurocentrism. Let's not solve the African problem by Eurocentric epistemologies. That will make us move in circles, like Wanjiku has rightly pointed out.
Thank you. From Jennifer Treadwell, what advice and thoughts can you offer on how can we decenter whiteness in order to dismantle structural and cultural racism?
Thank you very much, Jennifer Treadwell. Decentering is a very complex process that I am still grappling with. A few colleagues have written about it. I know there are 3 or 4 books that are out on how we need to decenter. But in order for us to decenter, Jennifer, we need to understand the center so that we then know how do we move around decentering the center. And one of the ways that we can do is to move away from the center as the center of knowledge. I remember when I was a student in Zimbabwe, our examinations were marked at Cambridge University, even if when we were writing in Zimbabwe. So for us, the education center was in the United Kingdom at Cambridge University. In order for us to decenter, we need to move away from the over-reliance on the self-inaugurated center as the center for everything. I'm just trying to think practically how we can do that. I think, Hoda, in order for me to be fair to Jennifer Treadwell, I will share with you, and then you can share with the class the readings that I am talking about, because I cannot I cannot respond sacrosanctly enough at a platform like this.
Of course, that'll be fine. Thank you so much. From Chris Ishe, Professor Benyera, is racism a one-way system or is it bi-directional?
Thank you very much, Chris Ishe. I have been asked by many people the question, can blacks be racist? Can we have racist blacks? And my answer has been very clear. A black person cannot be racist because they lack the institution to enforce racism. Stated differently, to demonstrate how blacks lack the institutions and the power. Each time that black people are wronged, they march, they demonstrate. But we have never seen the rich people of this world demonstrating and marching and giving memorandums and making demands. What do? They simply withhold their power. They simply discipline you because they have the power, they have the backing of the institutions to discipline you. So black people cannot be racist because they lack the institutions, they lack the power to enforce their prejudice. Hence, in my view, racism is unidirectional. And by the way, Chris, a black person is not a black person like me. And a white person is not a white person like what we call the Mulungus in Africa, which is the white people. Black and white is racial hierarchization. It is the inferior other and the superior other. So the inferior other could be having a white skin, and the superior other could be having a black skin. So blackness and whiteness are not cast in skin pigmentation, but they are existential. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Again, from Danielle Kuntz, epistemic freedom seems to be most easily expressed through music and the arts. How can we emulate that in the academy?
Yes, Danielle, epistemic freedom through the music and the arts. I love the arts, especially fine art, music, and poetry, because it gives us an entry point into reclaiming our epistemic freedom. We use our instruments, the kora, the djembe, the mbira, the marimba, and we sing in our own languages. But when we go to school, then we start speaking in English. This is what I, at another platform, speak about as an education and miseducation. I learned that from Chinwe Izu Chibikwe, a Nigerian philosopher. He said, to miseducate is to take the rat and give it the education of a cat, to a point where the rat thinks that it is a cat. And this rat will start killing other rats in the service of cathood. So this is the type of education that we are receiving. It's miseducation. We are being educated to be of no service to us, but to be of great service to the empire. Then to miseducate, in this chapter, I speak about it as a way of giving somebody irrelevant knowledge, irrelevant education, which does nothing to improve their condition or to solve their problems. So if we are to use music and the arts, it is a very good starting point into the entry of claiming our epistemic freedom. But we need to decolonize the education. We need to decolonize the curriculum so that we move away from miseducation and uneducating ourselves.
Thank you. From Regina Langout, I hope Langout, sorry if I mispronounce your name. Thank you so much for your provocative talk. Can you say more about racism as rooted in coloniality, the framework you use in this talk, which has some similarities to readings I have done by Quijano, Lugones, and Glissant, compared to understanding racism within the framework of racial capitalism via Cedric J. Robinson. I'm no expert, but I don't think Robinson locates racial capitalism with colonialism.
Thank you very much, Regina. Regina is correct in pointing to the existence of a group of colleagues from Latin America, Anibal Quijana, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Boa de Souza Santos, and Maria Lugones, who wrote about is there a feminist decolonial theory. Anibal Quijana is one of the three colleagues that contributed the most to the corpus of the decolonial literature. He developed the notion of coloniality of power. According to Quijano and the colleagues, coloniality stands on three legs, three analytical legs: coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, and coloniality of being. And there are three colleagues that worked on each one of these analytical concepts. Anibal Quijana worked on coloniality of power, which is the use of power to maintain the asymmetrical power relations long after the end of official colonization. So it could be at the multilateral level, at the United Nations, at the United Nations Security Council. We see that the asymmetrical power relations between the formerly colonized and the former colonizers is being through direct rule, but through the use of institutions and at times through the use of power, where NATO will simply say, we are disregarding the efforts by Africa to solve the Libyan problem. We have Leonardo Torres. He developed what he termed the coloniality of being. The coloniality of being simply says, if I may state it informally, as I am speaking to you, how much of me is still an African and how much of me is now a product of coloniality. So coloniality entered the black body and it is reproducing itself from there. So I may think that I'm teaching students at a university, yet I am producing compliant black subjects. That is coloniality of knowledge, that all the knowledge must come from the center, it must be authenticated there. And what we have here is not knowledge until it is authenticated from there. And finally, the coloniality, I spoke about power, being, and then the coloniality of knowledge obviously is linked to the coloniality of being. Those are the three from the colleagues in Latin America, but we also have got a lot of work which came from India. Gairak Spivak, can the sub out and think? That is a very important decolonial reading. I will again share some of this with you, then you can disseminate to our audience for their own reading and enjoyment.
Sorry, Amelia Mazloum, what book do you suggest a person read to be introduced to decolonizing theory?
Thank you very much. Decoloniality is a bit of a specialized field because what we do in decolonial studies is that we are learning to unlearn in order to relearn. Let me take that again. In decolonial studies, we are learning to unlearn in order to relearn. So it's almost like removing all the things that you imbibe and questioning yourself and finding a new way. And the biggest challenge is, how do you use a colonized head to decolonize itself? Because we only have got one head, and that head is a product of coloniality. So how do you use the same mind to decolonize itself? So we may need a lecture or two just on the concepts, on the logic, and then you can have all the readings and then you can make sense on your own. But there is a journal which was done in 2002, which I will share with you. It contains all the canonical readings on decoloniality, especially the notion of the abyssal line, because the abyssal line is an imaginary line which divides life from the zone of being and life on the zone of non-being. So you can find people crossing the Mediterranean because on that side is the zone of being. Where they are coming from is the zone of non-being. You see people scaling the Mexican wall because this side is the zone of non-being and this side is the zone of being. In the zone of non-being, I am now borrowing from one of the classical authors. Life is short, it is nasty, and it is very brutal. So this is why people will risk limb and arm to cross from the zone of non-being to the zone of being.
Thank you. Ximena Vidal, could you speak a little more about epistemology precedes ontology? There are different definitions, understandings of epistemology and ontology. What I understand is that the dominant ontology is one of dualism and individualism, the separation between us as individuals and the outside world, whether other individuals, nature, etc. So for me, this type of ontology informs my epistemology. That is, what is that I deem as valid knowledge.
Thank you very much. And that is a very valid perspective on the relationship between epistemology and ontology. But for the purpose of the analysis that I wanted to make about the source of the problem, which is the Western model of the nation state, for that example, epistemology precedes ontology because somebody sat down and designed that model of the nation state. They thought about it and then they created it. Then they imposed it on the Iberian Peninsula. Then it worked. When it worked, then they went to Berlin Conference. They sat down. They thought about what they were going to do in Africa and how they were going to do it and who is going to be doing what. Long days, long nights, thinking about what to go and do in Africa, then going to do it. And today we are still sitting with the same problem. So for the purposes of this example that we were discussing today, which is about the role of the state, especially the Western model of the state, which was imposed as a result of colonialism, epistemology precedes ontology. But yes, Zema is correct. There are other cases where you can argue that ontology can actually precede epistemology. And again, for what we are trying to do here, to imagine a different world, to imagine different relationships, I think we must sit down and think first and say, is confrontation working with the agents of racism? Should we not sit together and confront the state and reform the state, reimagine and think the state, but think the state from what it is towards what? What is the alternative to the state, not an alternative within the state? It's like arguing about a constitutional provision. We need to rise above that and question the constitution itself, not its contents. Thank you.
Rebecca Ellison asks, do you see examples of African ministries of education, including similar epistemologies in school textbooks?
We do not see a lot of change on the African syllabus in Africa, Rebecca, even at the university. There were a lot of demonstrations about decolonizing the curriculum, about bringing local knowledges. Because our problem in Africa is that you have a university in Zimbabwe, and there are so many problems in Zimbabwe. Thousands upon thousands of graduates are produced, and they are not employed. Is it not an oxymoron that the University of Zimbabwe's Department of Business Studies produces graduates who go and look for work? Are you not the cream of the society that upon entering at the university, already you've got ideas of how you are going to contribute to the economy, not as a worker, but as somebody who produces something new? So the education is still colonial education. The education that we are receiving and giving out does not help our students. Rwanda tried it a bit. They stopped the teaching of all history. They said, let's re-look into our history, unencumbered by the role of the Belgians and the influence of the French. Their history is now at a better point, but still, we still need, firstly, to recognize that what we are teaching is not helping our students, and then we move on to reform it.
Thank you. John Haynes asks, are the ideas that you are presenting in this lecture available in writing, such as articles or blog posts?
Thanks very much. I was speaking to you, Hoda, about this, that maybe after this discussion, I will make some corrections and then I will share this presentation with you, but also I will provide a list of readings that informed not only my presentation, but also my decolonial perspective, which I shared with you, so that they can be available to a wider audience. And thanks very much for that, John.
Sounds great. Jennifer Treadwell asked, before asking my question, I want to thank you so much, Professor Benyera, for your scintillating and brilliant presentation. And I'll move on to Teresa Ann, who asks, as a college student, what are the things I can do to combat Eurocentrism, given that our universities, not just in the US, but in the global South, follow Western thoughts / modes of thinking?
We do not want to discard Western epistemologies. All we are trying to do is also to bring epistemologies of the global South as concomitant epistemologies that are worth being studied at a university. We can do this through a non-confrontational way. I have had many students of mine that came to me with readings, with topics, and say to me, we have been reading about realism, we've been reading about structuralism and this. Please, can you teach us this? And then I took it upon myself to include that in the syllabus. So I am urging my listeners, our students, to be what are called active students, from the term active citizenry. Don't sit there to be a recipient of information, of knowledge that does not speak to your cosmology. Rather, also be proactive and politely nudge the authorities. Write a memo as a class, write a suggestion. I went to one university, I made a presentation like this. The students approached the administration and said, invite these people to speak to you about what they were speaking to us about. And that started a long process of decolonizing the curriculum and having decoloniality as a module studied for 2 years.
Very good. I think that is the end of our questions, Professor Benyera. I would like to again thank you for a very informative talk. I think we may just have to bring you back again to continue this very important discussion. And I really thank you because I know it's late right now in South Africa, and you've been so gracious in agreeing to give this talk at this time. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much to everyone for allowing me to share my views with you, and I hope to see you again very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to now tell you that we are reaching the end of our academic year at the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, and we don't have everything quite in place in terms of titles and dates and all of that, but we have some things to share with you. As you see, fall semester 2021 will start out with a climate justice conference. Everything, by the way, will be virtual for the time being. But that's on September 2nd. September 30th is our annual lecture featuring Professor Angela McRobbie. She will, of course, discuss issues related to feminism. And then you see the others listed there who will speak about all kinds of very important, relevant topics. So we ask you to please follow us on social media, check us on our website as we then update you on the dates and times of all of these events. Meanwhile, there may be other events that may pop up between now and September, and that's why we ask you to please follow us on our social media. Thank you to our viewers for joining us today. We really appreciate your support and your being here to carry on this very important discourse on very vital topics dealing with our world. And we look forward to seeing you in the near future. Thank you again, Professor Benyera, and goodbye to our viewers.